Okay, so I'm recording right now. We left off yesterday talking about connective tissues, and I'm going to finish that up, finish up connective tissues and tissues in general, because I'm not going to say a whole lot about muscular or nervous tissue. I'm just going to call up a whiteboard really fast. So the four main tissue types in the human body, I repeat this every day when I start talking about this, just because this is an organizational challenge. So the four main tissue types are, once again, epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. And so we're finishing up connective tissues. Within connective tissue, within that one major type, there are subcategories and subcategories. So there are four main subcategories within connective tissue. That's connective tissue proper, we did that. Cartilage, we've done those. Bone, we mentioned those at the end of yesterday's conversation. And number four is fluid. All four of those are, or all of those, I should say, are connective tissues. So I'm just going to move to big subcategory number four of connective tissues, and that's fluid. So I'm just going to write fluid, CT, for connective tissue. And that encompasses blood and lymph, or sometimes it's called lymph fluid. So I'm just admitting some new students right now. That's why I'm pausing. I'm just going to say a few things about blood. The reason that I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail or great detail is because if you take A&P2, which many of you or most of you probably will, the first unit you start when you take A&P2 is blood. So that's going to be on your horizon when you take A&P2 anyway. Okay, so I'm not going to do a whole lot about blood. Just remember that blood is a connective tissue. These are both fluid connective tissues, so the matrix, the non-living matrix in blood is plasma, blood plasma. That's the non-living matrix part of blood. And when you learn about blood in A&P2, you'll find out all the constituents. There's over 100 things dissolved in plasma, as well as living cells suspended in that tissue. So the matrix is plasma, the living cells. I'm going to need more space, so just let me erase my lymph for the moment. So the living cells in blood are red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, white blood cells, those are called leukocytes, and platelets, which are called thrombocytes. These are the living elements, really. Technically, platelets and red blood cells are not true cells in the sense of the word because they don't contain nuclei within the cells. White blood cells do. So, but the constituents of blood are basically this fluid, non-living matrix, and these living cells that are suspended in that fluid. Location of this, you know, is the cardiovascular system. So anywhere that the vessels go, blood is found. So it's found in arteries, veins, and capillaries, and the heart as well. Main function of this fluid connective tissue is transportation. Blood is a transport medium, that's what it is. It transports gases like oxygen, CO2, nutrients, waste products, metabolites, hormones. So its main function is transportation. Now I'm just going to say a few things about lymph. It's also a fluid connective tissue. Lymph fluid, some people just say lymph. That is the non-living matrix. The derivation of lymph fluid, just so you know, where does it come from? Where it's derived from. The derivation of lymph fluid is actually blood. It's fluid that has leaked out of the blood system. You'll learn about that when you study the immune and lymphatic system. Fluid leaks out of our blood on a daily basis. Most of it is reclaimed right away back into the cardiovascular system, back into the blood, but a certain amount of it is not. Like, I don't know if it's 1 to 3 liters per day of fluid actually ends up in lymph vessels. Anyway, that's where it comes from. So the matrix, the non-living matrix, is actually lymph fluid, and the living cells in lymph fluid are all white blood cells, mostly lymphocytes. That's a type of white blood cell. So I'm just going to write lymphocytes. Those are T cells and B cells, by the way. That's a type of white blood cell. That's where the lymphatic system gets its name. So lymphocytes are the living cells. And things like macrophages, those are a different type of immune cell. They're actually derived from a different type of white blood cell. And its location is just lymph capillaries, the lymph system. Function, yes, it is transportation, but also, as you know, all of these cells perform an immune function. Fights foreign microorganisms or infection that has gotten into the body. That's all I'm going to say about fluid connective tissue. And the good news is we're done with connective tissues. And I'm just going to say, I'm going to layer over this whiteboard right now and just remind you, epithelial tissues, we've finished. Connective tissue, we've now finished. I'm going to say a few things now about muscular tissue and nervous tissue. The reason I'm not going to go into great detail, that's supposed to be an R, is because we're going to study the muscular system and the nervous system in great detail later. So after we do the skeletal system. And we'll learn all about those tissues more in depth then. So really quickly, muscular tissue, there's 3 types. Skeletal muscle tissue. I'm going to go through these and give you general characteristics of each one. This is the stuff that's attached to bones. So skeletal muscle, technically, when you hear the word muscle, what you and I think of is skeletal muscle, because it's the muscles all over our body attached to bones. So location, yes, it's found all over the human body, but I'm just going to put attached to bones. Main function is movement of those bones. So the muscle, skeletal muscle tissue pulls on bones which act as levers. That gives us physical movement of our appendages. So I'm going to, before I leave skeletal muscle, here's some general characteristics of the tissue itself. Of skeletal muscle tissue. Those would be, first, the tissue is striated. All that means is when we look at this tissue under a microscope, it has stripes in a very regular arrangement, parallel arrangement. This muscle is voluntarily controlled. You want to move your left arm, you can move it. You want to take a step with your right foot, you can do that. So it's voluntarily controlled. We have conscious control over the contractions of this tissue. The cells in skeletal muscle tissue are multinucleate. You'll find out why that is when we study muscle tissue. So there's more than one nucleus per cell, per mature cell. I'm going to leave it there. There's many other characteristics in detail that you'll learn later. So that's the first type. Let's layer over and go to the second type of muscle tissue. I'm not sure I'm going in perfect order of your book. There's only 3. Everybody always does skeletal first, whether they do cardiac or smooth second, depends on the book you read. So smooth muscle, this is stuff that lines, so I'll write location. It lines visceral organs and vessel walls. So we find this stuff in the walls of our organs and our vessels, our arteries and veins. This stuff is involuntary. We do not have conscious control over the contractions of this type of muscle. There is 1 nucleus per cell, not multinucleate. There are no striations in this tissue, no stripes when we look at it under a microscope. That's where it gets its name, by the way, smooth muscle. It is not striated. And its main function, there's several, it's really to regulate or control organs and vessel walls. So the function is just going to write movement / contraction of organs and dilation, constriction of vessels. How our blood vessels can dilate, get wider in diameter, or constrict, get smaller in diameter, is through contractions or relaxation of smooth muscle in their walls. Okay, so number 3 is cardiac muscle. I'll try to squeeze it in on this page. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. That's its location. That's easy. This tissue is striated. I'm going to have to go horizontally here just to fit it in. So the cells are striated. That means they have those stripes when we look at it under the microscope. That's from overlapping myofilaments. You'll learn that when we talk about muscle tissue in detail. So like skeletal muscle, the cells have those stripes. It is striated. But like smooth muscle, this tissue is involuntary. We don't have conscious control over the contractions. While I'm sitting here talking to you, I can't just say, oh, I want to speed up my heart rate, and it does that, or slow it down. So involuntarily controlled, the cells typically have 1 to 2 nuclei per cell. So not as many nuclei per cell as skeletal muscle, but typically a 1 to 2, which would be more than smooth muscle. Main function, all muscle, by the way, contracts. That means it gets shorter in length, and usually that performs some sort of action. So the function of this, as you know, is to cause the heart to contract and pump blood. The heart is just a pump. It keeps blood, that connective tissue, circulating throughout our vessels. All right, that's all I'm going to say about cardiac muscle as well. So we're finished with muscle. So if I go all the way back to my original, or my second page here, now we've done muscular tissue. So I'm going to cross this off, we've done muscular. I'm going to say a few things about nervous next. So let's go to our 4th and final tissue, is nervous tissue. So it's a big number 4. Let's stay consistent. The location of this type of tissue is isolated to the brain, spinal cord, and what we call peripheral nerves. We're going to study the nervous system at the end of this course in super great detail, and it's very complicated. But here's the whole nervous system. I'm going to do it from the side view. Here's the brain. Here's the spinal cord that runs down our vertebrae. And then peripheral nerves just run off of actually the brain stem and the spinal cord all the way down, all the way out to our fingers and toes. And obviously it branches as it does that. So that's the entire nervous system anatomically. There are 2 major cell types in this tissue. The first are neurons. So I want you just to get used to this language. These are the cells that produce and transmit electrical impulses. And an individual nerve cell or neuron, it kind of looks like this. There's a cell body, and there's all of these branches, they're called processes, that extend away from this cell body. So there's a body with a nucleus in the middle, and then there's all these, what you and I would call branches, but in anatomy speak, they're called cell processes. That's kind of what a typical neuron looks like. And it generates an electrical impulse right at this area and sends it down this long stem or process called an axon. So we're going to learn all about that when we study nervous systems. The second class or type of cells in nervous tissue are called neuroglia, G-L-I-A, neuroglia. These do not produce or transmit electrical impulses. They are, I'm going to put this in quotes, these are like helper or assistant cells to the neurons. They perform all sorts of functions. There's four different types in the central nervous system and 2 different types in the peripheral nervous system, so 6 altogether, separate neuroglia. I'm not going to list them. You don't have to learn them yet until we do the nervous system. But as a group, I want you to know that these produce and transmit electrical impulses. These are helper cells that don't do that and do all sorts of other functions that we'll learn later. So now we're finished with tissue, which is a great thing because I need to get on to, I'm going to start talking about the integumentary system. And we're going to spend 2 days doing that. At least I'm going to spend 2 days. So as always, my disclaimer, in this disclaimer bit, I don't want you to take these lectures as this is all you need to know for a quiz. In order to perform really well in this class, to succeed really well, I highly recommend that you read the sections in the book that I outline in each week's outline. You either attend these online Zoom meetings for explanation, or if you can't do that, then watch the recording. Even better, do it more than once. Watch the recording twice. And then obviously study the material and ask me any questions. So now we're going to go on to our first system. From now on in A&P, you're just going to study the human body system by system. So we're done with tissues. I'm going to go back to my whiteboard, and our first official system That's supposed to be an M. Sorry, I'm trying to write quickly. Integumentary system. This is an organ system. You and I, we just think of skin because that's the obvious part of this system, but it includes skin, hair, nails, and glands. So all of these things are included in this system. We're going to mostly talk about the skin, but we are going to briefly learn about hair, nails, and gland types as well. We're going to get more specific with our gland types. So let's just start with this one, the skin. This component of the integumentary system. And I'm going to detail the functions of the integumentary system and detailed functions later. So I'm going to skip right to the anatomical structures within the skin. First, there are two main layers in the skin. The epidermis and the dermis. Within the epidermis, there are 5 sublayers within that epidermal main layer. And the dermis has 2 layers to it, or 2 sublayers if you want to think of it that way. Now here's the, if you've never looked at a skin sample under a microscope, it can be deceiving. The epidermis as a whole is much, much thinner than the dermis. So if we, in context, this is what the skin really looks like. I'm just going to use a blue. The epidermis, if we look at a tissue sample of the skin under a microscope, on low magnification, low power, it looks something like this. Everything that I have put in blue, so all of this stuff up here, that's all 5 layers of the epidermis. And the 2 layers of the dermis comprise this. So even though there's only 2 layers in the dermis, you can see that those 2 layers are many times more thick than the epidermis layer. So that's just wrap your head around that, because that will come in handy later. I'm just coloring this in for you. So all 5 layers of the epidermis are in this thin blue band, much, much thinner than dermal layers. Now I'm going to break these 2 down. We're going to learn the 5 layers of the epidermis, and then we're going to learn the 2 layers of the dermis and everything that's in them. The word hypodermis, by the way, refers to tissue under the skin. So the hypodermis is not part of the skin. So the deepest layer of the skin is not the hypodermis, it is the last layer of the dermis down here, which, by the way, is the thickest one. All right, now I'm going to go to a new page, and we're just going to look at, we're going to list some cells of the epidermis. So we're just going to look at the 5 layers of the epidermis. But before we do that, these are the types of cells that we find in the epidermis. First, the epidermis is avascular. That's supposed to be a U, no direct blood supply. All right, now let's get on to these cell types. I'll just list them. Keratinocytes, These are cells that produce keratin. Keratin is a very tough fibrous protein. Keratin is what gives our skin its toughness, as well as our hair and our nails. So keratin itself is a tough fibrous protein. These make up most of the cells in the epidermis. I'm just going to write most abundant cell type. Okay. Now, a different cell type, basal stem cells. We'll find out where all of these, I'll draw a picture of where all of these are located in a minute. Basal stem cells are actually the stem cells that produce these. So basal stem cells produce keratinocytes, and these are constantly undergoing mitosis. I'm just going to write constantly mitotic. And so they're constantly dividing through mitosis, producing new cells, these basal stem cells. They give rise to keratinocytes. These basal stem cells are in the deepest layer of the epidermis, that blue layer that I drew on the previous page. Melanocytes, different type of cell, also found in the stratum basal, but I'm just going to put also deep in the epidermis, deep in that blue layer, and they produce a pigment called melanin. I'll talk more about that later. Melanin is just a dark pigment that not only gives our skin, contributes to our skin color, but it also protects. Really what it is, melanin, it protects melanocytes and basal stem cells from UV light, ultraviolet light from the sun. So if this is a melanocyte, I'll show you where it is in a minute. When UV light, UV rays from the sun penetrate through our upper layers of the epidermis and make their way down to the melanocytes, these cells secrete, they sort of ooze this dark pigment, and that protects it. It's a protective coating that protects the melanocyte itself, as well as a stem cell, a basal stem cell, which resides right next to it. So it's actually activated by sunlight. All right, a couple more. I'm just going to layer over this and a couple more cell types in the epidermis. That's an E, D-E-N-D-R-I-T-I-C. It's pronounced dendritic. Dendritic cells, they actually are derived from the bone marrow. That's where they come from. They're also called Langerhans cells, after the French guy who discovered them. Or maybe he's German, I forget. So Langerhans cells is just another name for a dendritic cell. They act as immune cells. They're called dendritic cells because they're spiky shaped like this. And they hang out in the upper layers of our dermis. And what they do is they capture any bacteria or foreign microorganisms that penetrate through our skin. So if this is a bad thing that is penetrated through the upper layers of our epidermis, or all at this dendritic cell captures that, transports it to our lymphatic system, like a lymph node, where it presents that bacteria to a lymphocyte, a T cell or a B cell, to destroy it, or to a macrophage. So these immune cells, they're actually called antigen presenting cell because they capture these foreign microorganisms and then present them to a killer cell of our immune system. All right, last cell type on my list are tactile Merkel cells. It's MERKEL. These are touch receptors, by the way. They're connected to a sensory nerve. And they act as touch receptors. These are located at the boundary of the dermis and epidermis. These are light touch receptors, which are different type of sensory receptor than deep pressure receptors. That's a type of pain receptor, actually. So those are the cell types that we find in the epidermis. Now I'm just going to layer on this in case I need to go back, and we're going to pictorially look at the 5 layers of the epidermis. Remember, those 5 layers compared to or in context to the entire skin are very thin. It was that thin blue layer that I drew at the beginning of this. So let's just layer them. I mean, just number them one by one. By the way, when we number these, if this is the boundary between epidermis and all of this is dermis, and by the way, this would be much thicker this way. It's multiple times as thick as the epidermis. But the 5 layers of the epidermis, we number them from here, down here at the base layer. So it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just so you know. So when I put a number 1 here, I'm not talking about the top layer. I'm actually talking about the deepest layer of the epidermis. All books number them this way. And then to make it even more confusing, when I get to the dermis, which will probably be tomorrow, we number the dermal layers 1 and 2 in the opposite direction. So epidermal layers, when I number them 1 through 5, are going to go from the base up, and dermal layers from here down. All right, so let's just start with these layers. So the first layer in the epidermis is called the stratum basal. That just means base layer, because it's the deepest layer of the epidermis, not of the skin, just of the epidermis. So deepest layer of the epidermis. I'm going to try to go quickly because I've got a lot of ground to cover. If this is a single row, so it's a single 1-cell layer thick of basal stem cells and melanocytes. Okay, so these are the 2 types of cells we find in the stratum basal. And it's a very thin layer. It's only a single cell layer thick. So these guys, just to remind you, the basal stem cells give rise to keratinocytes. Melanocytes secrete melanin when stimulated by UV light, and that function of that pigment is protection. So if I were to draw this, here's the bottom of that epidermal layer. We're just talking about the epidermis now. The melanocytes are usually dark cells. They're dark staining cells that sit like this along this bottom edge of the epidermis. The stem cells just stain a little bit lighter, so I'm going to leave them open. So this is kind of what the stratum basale looks like. These basal stem cells are just constantly mitotically dividing to produce new cells. That's all they do, is they sit down here and divide. The melanocytes, when UV light penetrates from the sun all the way down through the layers of our skin, they ooze this pigment called melanin that helps protect and cover the deepest layers of the epidermis. That's really how those two things function. So the basal stem cells continually divide, and it's a very thin layer. So here's layer number 1. Layer number 2 that I'm going to talk about next is thicker. That sits above layer number 1. So let's layer over this. Layer number 2 in the epidermis is called the stratum spinosum. S-P-I-N-O-S-U-M. That's just because the cells are spike-shaped or spine-shaped. That's where it gets its name. So the cells kind of look like those dendritic cells that I drew earlier. They have little spikes or spines on them. In this layer, it's a much thicker layer. So it's typically described as anywhere from 10 to 20 cell layers thick. That varies, that number varies based on what book you read. But nevertheless, it's quite a bit thicker in number of cell layers than the stratum basale. Mitosis still occurs, so there's still some cellular division in this layer. Mitosis occurs. We still call the cells at this point are alive, so the cells are living. They're going to die very quickly once they reach the top of this layer. Melanin granules are typically found at the base of this layer. So those melanocytes, when they ooze that pigment, it goes up into the spinosum layer as well. It's just sort of umbrella or cover the basal layer. So we find actual melanin granules in the stratum spinosum layer. Dendritic cells are also found here. So I'm just going to write melanin granules that are secreted by melanocytes and dendritic cells are also camp out in this layer. Let's go on to layer 3. I'll draw a final picture of these layers after I list all of them. It's the stratum granulosum. It's a thin layer, not quite as thin as the stratum basale, but it's like usually 2 or 3 cell layers thick, sometimes up to 5. I'm just giving you some context, that's all. The stratum granulosum gets its name specifically because there are 2 types of granules produced in the cytoplasm of the cells in this layer. So first and foremost, I'm going to say some things. We have the process of what we call keratinization. Keratinization, that's a verb, occurs in this layer. All that means is the cells start to produce and accumulate that protein keratin. The cells also die in this layer. So as the cells from the stratum basale down here, from those stem cells that I drew earlier, new cells are constantly being made or produced. And so because this is a cell manufacturing plant down here, it pushes the older cells up toward the top of our skin, up toward the very top. As they move from the deeper layers to the uppermost layer, they die at about the stratum granulosum layer. Cells are no longer living, but the cytoplasms produce keratin, that tough protein material that gives them their. So I'm going to write two types of granules. This is where the layer gets its name, that are produced by the cells in this layer. They're called keratohyalin granules. Remember, hyaline cartilage gets its name because these are very tough granules, hard and tough. They help form more keratin as the cell migrates toward the top of our skin. So keratohyalin granules, just put produce if you want to remember, they just help with the keratin production. And something called lamellar granules. These are important, so I'm going to star these. Lamellar granules produce a glycolipid that gives our skin its waterproofing ability. So these granules, glyco just means sugar, lipid, you know, means fat. So it's a combination of a carb-fat granule that gives our skin its waterproofing ability. So when you go into the ocean or swimming pool or take a shower, the main reason that water doesn't get through your skin to your insides are due to this layer in your epidermis called the stratum granulosum. All right, layer number 4, as we move to the top, is called the stratum lucidum. That's supposed to be L-U-C-I-D-U-M. It's a very thin layer. It's clear, that's where it gets its name. Lucid means clear. It's a thin, clear layer, only found in what textbooks call thick skin. That's the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Okay, so we wouldn't find this layer anywhere else on the human body, but the palms and the soles. And in this layer, keratohyalin granules stick to keratin filaments in cells and create a layer of intermediate filaments called tonofilaments. So this layer just produces sort of it's an extra layer called tonofilaments. That helps exaggerate. Remember when I was drawing this border between epidermis and dermis down here? Those tonofilaments help exaggerate these hills and valleys on the palms and soles. And technically, that's what gives us our fingerprints when we do a fingerprint. All right, layer number 5. Let me go back to my black pen. This is the top outermost layer of the skin. It's called the stratum corneum, C-O-R-N-E-U-M. It is the most superficial layer. It's also the thickest layer of the epidermis. It's anywhere from 30 to 40 cell layers thick, depending on where on the human body. At this point, it's basically just flat, dead cells. And when we were learning epithelial tissues, one of our examples was stratified squamous epithelium. And that's what this is. It's just flat, multiple layers of flat cells. What happens is, as these cells move from down here, where they're produced, the living cells, as they move up, and the older generations die, they also start to flatten out. They get squished, compressed together. So at the top of our skin, we've got multiple cell layers of these really flat cells, and this just sloughs off the superficial layer just comes off almost constantly all day long. We're just not aware of it most of the time. This also, the only thing I'm going to say left about this stratum corneum layer is that these cells still contain these glycolipids from the stratum granulosum layer that also helps with waterproofing. But its main function, this last layer, is protection. That's why it's tough, thick, and the cells are knitted together, almost glued together. All right, those are the 5 layers of the epidermis. I'm going to just start talking about the 2 layers of the dermis, and then we'll call it a day. Just to remind you really quickly, if this is the top of our skin, that's stratum corneum, here's all 5 layers of the epidermis. When we talk about the dermal layers, which I'm going to next, there's a looser tissue layer right here, and then a very dense, thick layer below that. So if we were to look at a real skin sample, it would look like this, meaning 5 layers of the epidermis are very thin relative to the 2 layers of the dermis. So I'm going to number these layer 1 and layer 2. Layer 2, by the way, is the deepest layer of the skin and the thickest layer of the skin. So that just gives you some sort of visual context. Now I'm going to talk about the dermis. This is basically, give you some general characteristics. This is thick, tough, connective tissue in general. The cell types that we find, there's multiple in the dermis. So I'm going to just give you a list. Fibroblasts, those are immature cells that secrete fibers. Macrophages, get used to that term because in almost every organ system in the human body, we mention the word macrophage. These are immune cells, they're non-specific immune cells. The word or the term non-specific just means they will go after anything foreign, any foreign cell pretty much in the human body. Mast cells, which mediate inflammation. So I'm just going to write inflammation to remind you of that. A lot of these are repeat from connective tissue because that's what this is. Leukocytes, which are white blood cells. We also have, I'll put a period here. This is rich. The dermis is rich in vascularization, blood vessels, which the epidermis was completely void of. So rich vascularization, that means blood supply, lymph vessels, and nerves. So all of the business end of the skin almost is going on in the dermis. It's a bit more complicated in terms of its function. Much of the epidermis is just dead cells, tough proteinaceous dead cells for protection. Now I'm going to specifically talk about the two layers of the dermis. So number one, that's closest to the epidermis. It's the top layer of the dermis. And it's called the papillary dermis. Papilla, the word papilla means finger-like. And under a microscope, the papillary dermis makes those hills and valleys. I'm just telling you, this is where it got its name. This hill is called a dermal papilla because it looks like a finger sticking upright. So this is made up of areolar connective tissue, predominantly. There are collagen and elastic fibers found in this tissue. Collagen, remember, for strength, elasticity for recoil. You know that if you yank on your skin and pull it, if you let go, it snaps back into position. There are also lots of blood vessels. And those blood vessels, so this is the layer we're talking about. Let me draw a larger picture. This areolar connective tissue is found right under the stratum basale of the epidermis here. And the blood vessels in this tissue actually supply nutrition through diffusion, oxygen, to those stem cells and melanocytes, the living cells in the epidermis found down here. They get their nutrition from the blood vessels in the papillary dermis. Also in this layer, I'm just switching back to my black pen. We have a lot of nerve endings. Capillaries or blood vessels is what supplies that nutrition, but there are touch receptors in this area, as well as deep pressure. Remember, those touch receptors are called Merkel cells. That's for light touch, but we also have deep pressure, which are Meissner's corpuscles, M-E-I-S-S-N-E-R. Receptors found in this area as well. Remember, it's this boundary between the papillary dermis and the epidermis that gives us our fingerprints. Lastly, this papillary dermis helps anchor or secure the epidermis down. So there is a function to this zigzag pattern. I'm just going to write helps anchor epidermis. So this helps hold the epidermal layers down, helps glue them, those layers, to the deeper layers of our skin. When we bump something, so here's the top of our skin, if we bump against something, scrape our skin, this sort of sawtooth knitted boundary line really helps hold the skin down. If it was just flat like this, the upper layers of the epidermis would easily come off from physical damage or bumping, scraping, whatever. Last layer, I'm not going to get through the dermis most likely, but I'm just going to mention layer number 2 of the dermis is called the reticular dermis. First and foremost, this is the deepest layer of the skin. It's also the thickest layer of the skin. It's about 80% of the skin's thickness. This is the type of tissue it is. It's dense, irregular, connective tissue. When we look at it under a slide, under a microscope, it just looks like chunks of raw meat. It's irregularly arranged. There are spaces in there, but it's fairly densely packed, especially when you look at it compared to the sort of light, airy look of the areolar connective tissue found up in the papillary dermis. We also have, I'm going back to my black pen, there is some adipose tissue found in this layer. The hypodermis below this, which is not part of the skin, by the way, is almost all adipose tissue, but the reticular dermis does contain some adipose tissue. It's highly vascular. Lots of blood supply. It also contains a lot of collagen for strength and collagen fibers. And they run parallel to the skin surface to try to help glue down all of the above layers. All right, guys, I'm going to stop there. So let's just call that a day. Tomorrow I will finish up. Tomorrow's Wednesday. Let me just stop my recording.